So to introduce myself, my name is Annabelle Johnson and I'm the CEO at New South Wales Farmers. It's my honour to welcome you here to the Ridges Hotel Parramatta, again ahead of our 2025 annual conference. Our Monday night welcomer drinks is now in its fourth year, and this is looking like the biggest year that we've had so far, which can be put down to the quality of panellists that we have. So the panel is made up of political, economic and agricultural professionals to discuss the 3 Ts: Trump, tariffs and trade. So these topics, when we were thinking about what we talked about in January, we thought, will this still be topical? Will people want to be talking about Trump and tariffs, or would it quieten down and we'll just be understanding what trade looks like? Fortunately, we took a gamble, and I think everyone is looking forward to hearing about what it's looking like and what people are predicting. So what I'd like to do is welcome our moderator, the Daily Telegraph state political reporter and New England native, for those from that area, Madeline Bauer, and our panellists. So, Madeline. And our panellist, US political expert, Jared Monenschein from the US Studies Centre. Dennis Vodnensky, an agricultural economist. Maury, Farmer and Vice President of New South Wales Farmers, Rebecca Reardon. CropLife CEO, Matthew Cossey. And finally, General Manager of AgriFutures, Simon Vincent.
Alrighty, so I think let's begin with Donald Trump because he's the one that started this all off. So Jared, let's start with you. Obviously, earlier this year when Trump imposed the blanket 10% ban on Australian goods, it was a bit of a shock. Is that better? Yeah? It was a bit of a shock. So are we expecting more or is this it?
We're expecting more. Am I done? Yeah, no, this is Donald Trump's playbook. We've seen this in the first Trump administration. He took a little while to sort of gain his footing to know how the tariff stuff worked. He didn't even know. He's been talking about tariffs consistently the same way since the 1980s. Doesn't matter how many times you tell him it's actually not a tax on the foreign entity exporting, but actually a tax on Americans, he doesn't change his opinion. He's not he's not consistent on many aspects of his life. Politics. He used to be a Democrat, a Republican. His policies, he's all over the shop. Even during the election, he said that he was open to giving every foreigner who graduated from a U.S. college a permanent residency, which is not even something the most progressive Democrats were asking for. But he, even his personal life, there's some inconsistencies there. But he is consistent on tariffs, time and time again. And this is something that, in many ways, we just have to get used to. You'll notice that when Penny Wong went to meet with Marco Rubio for the Quad meeting, U.S., Australia, Japan, India, there was some criticism of her for not securing some carve-outs for Australia. But I think people have to understand that there's nothing that Marco Rubio can do. When he came out with those tariffs, do you know how soon beforehand he decided what those tariff rates were going to be? 4 hours. That's it, 4 hours. This is his fixation, and it is something that no one can really change that much. And more than anything else, I think the focus is trying to mitigate losses. And that's where I think Australia actually has some agency in working with like-minded allies and partners.
Right, so this is not going to be a taco mantra, Trump always chickens out. This is here to stay as long as his administration is, from the sounds of things.
Well, I mean, the bond market will force him to chicken out eventually, as it did before, but it depends on just how bad. And as soon as the bond market recovers, then he will once again want to push this button. It will, basically what I'm saying is it will remain a fixation for him. It doesn't matter if his grievance with other countries is economic or security. His favorite tool is tariffs.
Now, the Prime Minister is yet to secure a meeting with him. Do you think a meeting between the Prime Minister and Trump would change the tariff state of play?
Yes, it would. And then the next day it would change again. I think trying to fixate on that is just not where I think Australia should put all of its eggs, if that makes sense, right? You can see Vietnam, a really integral player for diversifying away from China. They thought they had a trade deal with the Trump administration, and they did with the administration, just not with Trump. And then just as they were about to announce it, lo and behold, he changed everything. So that's why I'm saying at a certain point you have to realize, all right, this is going to remain an area of irritation and challenge, and we can either keep hitting our head against the same wall, or we can try to put our focus into areas where we actually have some influence and have more agency.
Right. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, CPTPP. So basically, when America takes its toys and goes home, Australia and Japan, and like-minded allies and partners, can work together to try to provide a bulwark and bolster some economic certainty in an era of unprecedented uncertainty. So, and I think that is the pathway forward. Working with Europe, working with less mercurial actors, right? I think Australia has been doing it, and it has to do more. And working with India, I think as we learned from the first Trump administration what worked, and I think he clearly is more confident in his role now as president. He's had a lot more time to get adjusted to it, and we also have to become more confident around the world amongst U.S. allies and partners on how to deal with it, and that includes working with more like-minded allies and partners.
If we had, say, a more Trumpian-style leader or a more Trumpian-style ambassador, do you think we would get a different outcome on tariffs?
Yes, and then the next day it would change again. This is Donald Trump, right? Like I can talk at length about security policy and what's going to stay the same and what's going to shift and what's bipartisan. That the main thing, I've said this before, the main thing to focus with the U.S. right now is the difference between structure and agency. Donald Trump has a lot of agency as the president of the United States to do whatever he wants on tariffs. So Congress has ceded that responsibility, even though it's their constitutional duty. The structural dynamics, though, are security. Will any U.S. president, whoever wins the next presidency, wake up and say that China's their best friend and there's no security tensions? No. Will any American president wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, it's fair that Americans are paying 2 to 3 times as much on pharmaceuticals as the rest of the developed world? No. Some things are structural, right? But some things are unique to Trump. And I think the tariff agenda, I've never seen, and no one has seen a U.S. president engage in a tariff agenda like this. And I doubt we're going to see one moving forward. With that said, look at what happened the last time Donald Trump left office. Did the tariffs on China change when Joe Biden took office? No. He actually kept all of them and added more on Chinese electric vehicles. So I think that is maybe the structure. But the haphazard, ad hoc tariffs on allies and partners, that is very Trumpian.
Let's bring it a little bit more closer to home. Rebecca, tell me, how are the tariffs at the moment impacting growers and primary producers?
Look, there's a lot of talk on this, but it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if Trump's going to wake up and change the tariffs tomorrow, who he's going to put the tariffs on, what level they're going to be at, how people are going to retaliate, how people are going to try and negotiate their way out of it. So I think there's a lot of talk about what it's going to do, but I don't think anyone can know, because to Jared's point, we don't know what's going to happen. But if you go out to the grains industry and say, what do tariffs mean for us? Most of them will tell you, not much. It's not going to change much. It will change some of our trade flows. So if you take grains, for example, it may be an opportunity, because if China introduces, or China keeps on with the tariffs on US, it opens the door for Australian grain to make its way into China. On the other hand, you've just had Indonesia have just negotiated to buy probably double what they've bought in the past of wheat in an effort to try and reduce their tariff. So they're now going to buy 1 million tonnes a year per annum for the next 5 years. So we don't know what the net effect is going to be, but generally speaking, Australia is really, really good, and we saw that in the 2018-19. We've seen that in the past, where we're really good at finding markets, and the whole free trade liberalisation has made us very good at negotiating and opening markets and getting rid of tariffs. And I think it means we will find a way through this. If you go back to, say, 2023, when we had an 80% barley tariff put on us by China, we actually, yes, there was probably a bit of an economic hit on price, but we found other markets. We opened markets in South America, which we still got today, and we are still selling into today. Take the Ukraine war. Everyone said there is no way that grain is going to get out from Russia now. And we saw a huge spike in prices. But what's happened today? That grain is all flowing onto the market. So these markets have a way of sorting themselves out. And I think when you come to the grains industry, which is where my background is, really the trade is not that concerned about it because they will find a way through it. And we're very, very good at that. I think there are other industries like, say, your beef and your lamb, which are probably more dependent on directly into the US. But if you take lamb, 70% of exports come from Australia and New Zealand. So where else are they going to go to buy that lamb? And if you look at beef, US beef herd is at a 70-year low. They've just banned Mexican beef coming in because of screwworms. Is it really going to affect our beef imports? And I think there's really a theory out there that no, it's not. And there's one figure which I quite like, which says, how much is this tariff going to add to the price of a hamburger? And they're saying it's between 1 cent and 10 cents a burger over in the US. And that 10 cents is if you assume we're going to put 100% of high quality Australian beef into that burger. So is 1 to 5 cents really going to change the demand for Australian beef? So in general, we don't know what's going to happen, but I would say there's going to be opportunities here as well as probably some costs along the way. But generally overall, it depends on the commodity very much. But you know, if you take grains, which is my background, the industry is really not too concerned about it and believes the opportunities will come about because of it.
And you mentioned the trade barriers that China put in place from 2020 to 2024, and they were obviously very damaging. I mean, what lessons did, especially the grain sector, learn from that? That should more tariffs be implemented, that would help Australia?
You mean domestically?
Yeah, domestically.
I don't think that's going to achieve anything, particularly because we are so dependent on imports. So if we start putting on tariff and have retaliation, our import costs are going to go through the roof because we're very dependent on chemicals, fertiliser, fuel and all these things. I think we will, so I don't think we should be retaliating with tariffs. I think we just need to go out there and do what we're very good at, which is finding markets, which is what we did, all our industries did when we hit with those tariffs in 2020 to 2023 from China.
Now, Dennis, and I'm taking on from Rebecca here when she mentioned the impacts of the Ukraine war. So obviously you've looked quite a bit into the history of conflicts and their impacts on the global markets. Where do these tariffs fit in terms of those kind of economic shocks that we've seen?
It's interesting when we, I'm not sure if the mic's working. Yeah?
Close.
Okay. It's interesting when you look at tariffs sometimes, you try to, especially the US tariffs, you look at them and you try to figure out what's the logic behind them, because say you take the last 60 years and everything's been about achieving the highest possible economic growth, and as a result, anything that would support more economic growth, you go great in terms of policy, and anything that won't support economic growth, you go that's a poor policy. But we're moving into this period of geopolitical rivalry when it makes more economic sense sometimes to say build up critical industries. Yeah, it's an upsetting message, I know. I agree. But we now have to start, the US is putting in place certain policies where they start shoring up critical industries. Could be, for example, related to shipbuilding. And it's not the most economically viable thing to do. Maybe it's more economical to produce the ship, create the ships elsewhere and then buy them, for the US to buy them. But from a geopolitical sense, it makes a lot more sense to be able to actually create your own ships, because in times of crisis, the countries that actually thrive and can do well and can support allies when they need it are the ones who, for example, have ships. In regards to agricultural tariffs, I think, like you mentioned, they're not going to really go anywhere, or tariffs more broadly. So far, we've actually been doing surprisingly well. So from a grain perspective, and let's take canola as well, and beef. We'll go through the whole lot. So if you look at the tariffs between the US and China, so far the benefit is that we're actually getting a larger share in the Chinese market, regardless of what commodity you look at. Overall, their demand is subdued, but that's for everyone. But as a result of the tariff war, they're taking in a larger share of grains from us. If you look at canola, well, China used to buy a lot of soybeans from America, and because of the rift from a geopolitical sense, they're trying to diversify that as much as they can. So they said, we're not going to buy as many soybeans from the US. We're going to buy more from South America, but there's only so many there, so they're going to have to come for other oil seeds, including canola. And just to give you a little bit of context, the most we've ever produced as an industry nationally of wheat, barley, canola, pulses, lump it all together, is 60 million tons this year. China's predicted to import 110 million tons of just soybeans. And there's physically not enough in the world if you're not going to buy from America. So that before, for example, going back to America, they're trying to go everywhere else to get those oil seeds. From a beef perspective, yeah, US cattle herd is at a 70-year low. They can't get cattle from Mexico because of New Age screwworm. They can't get enough cattle from Canada because they're rebuilding their own herd, and their herd's been drawn down. And Trump's about to put a 50% tariff on Brazil as of the 1st of August. And then you run out of beef apart from us. And our exports to the US are already up 30% this year so far. I ramble for a little bit too long, so stop me. I swear this is going to be the last one. What were we talking about? Oh, we're talking about the Indonesia-US trade deal just then. The challenge is, for now, that it's relatively small, so it's not going to impact us too much. But the problem is that we're going to have to send grain even further afield, and there's going to be a higher freight cost. And when there's a higher freight cost involved with getting our grain to our end customer, it eats away at what price we can get on the local market. That's the challenge, and it's the challenge especially if there's going to be more trade deals like this. So Bangladesh just announced a deal with the US for 700,000 tons of grain. On its own, not that much, but if you add them all up bit by bit, it might become a problem.
So the prognosis is pretty positive then in terms of the way that these tariffs have impacted Australia. But I mean, in terms of, we're seeing the US and China slinging tit-for-tat tariffs at each other. Now, that trade war, that could impact Australia quite heavily. I mean, what kind of impacts could we see if that gets particularly bad?
Well, if Chinese economic growth gets hit more, that'll be problematic because whenever China has an economic issue, it just reduces demand overall for any commodity. That's going to be a big problem. And I'm probably moving too much into your area, but the further you shift into this west and east divide, you start getting countries like the US asking us, hey, which side do you want to be on? And for now, it's political, and then eventually it leads to, hey, well, if you're on our side, maybe you don't want to sell to the people we're not friends with. That's the really scary part, if we actually get to that point, because regardless of what commodity we look at, we send a lot to China.
Now, Simon, I wanted to ask you, so obviously, and Dennis mentioned the Brazilian tariff on beef, which would be a big opportunity for beef royals in Australia. I mean, what opportunities for Australian primary producers do these tariffs offer?
I mean, it's wonderful that everyone's, I guess, validated the research that we've recently done as AgriFutures Australia, that we got Australian Farm Institute to do. It's just been released up on the website, Navigating the New World Order, Australia's place in the global trade wars. So, yeah, there are tremendous opportunities, and you know, effectively what will happen with these tariffs, as the other panelists have talked about, is there'll just be a reallocation of the goods to different markets. So in a lot of in the 5 scenarios that the report modelled, the only scenario that had a sort of negative impact really was this decrease in a significant tariff on China and a drop in GDP in China, which would lead to a decrease in consumption. The big opportunities, though, for us, I think it fundamentally just lies in Australian ag's inherent competitive advantage, which is that it's simply a premium product that can be relied on for its food safety and its quality. And so continuing the research and development into sector-specific R&D that's going to do both of those things is going to lead to big opportunities. To what Rebecca's saying, we're really good at finding new markets. So if we underpin that with really, really good R&D, we're going to be able to be more successful in accessing those markets. The other big opportunity for us here is it's actually not about the tariffs; it's about the non-tariff barriers. And I know some of my other panelists will be able to talk a lot more to this one. But it's the industry working really closely with government to try to close as much as possible the leakage that comes from non-tariff barriers. And we all know what they are. They add more cost and complexity to supply chains. And I think that's if we can work on and be thinking about this from a non-tariff perspective. And I know it's not one of the T's, the 3 T's, But it's that's actually where we can start getting some more opportunity to get into some of those new markets as well.
Do you have
later
an
on.
example of any of those non-tariff barriers that really need to be?
Well, yeah. Well, just anything in relation to client, proving or justifying sort of a climate or sustainability credentials, biosecurity standards, that sort of thing. That's what I'm referring to around the non-tariff barriers, and anything that is particularly coming out of Europe. That is adding additional levels of reporting or data for Australian growers in order to access those markets. It's just that's what is going to be impacting our bottom line as a sector, as opposed to these tariffs.
Now, Matthew, I wanted to ask you about something a little bit left of field, which is the Make America Healthy Again mantra that the Trump administration is doing, which is essentially what mandated sort of health outcomes, including how much chemical can be in food. Does this have any impact at all on our ability to export to the US and the way we need to grow?
Well, I think they're still trying to figure out exactly what "Make America Healthy Again" means, because there's not much science at the basis of it. And I think, as Simon's just touched on, and Beck earlier, I mean, there's always been a disruptor in global trade for the last couple of decades. It happens to be the US at the moment. It was China for us before. Europe's dabbled a bit. And while we don't want tariffs and we don't want domestic agendas in other countries warping our own policies, the more that's actually the thing that I'm most concerned about. It's a more insidious form of disruption to trade. As Beck touched on, we can get around tariffs and we can find new markets. But, for example, when we have the EU trying to dictate as part of a free trade agreement with us what agronomic policy should be in Australia, how Australian farmers should farm if we want to do business with them, they are the policy challenges that are very difficult and I think pose a much greater problem for Australian farming. And a little ironically too, because on any measure, our farmers are more productive, more environmentally sustainable, better best practice managers. So those sorts of measures, whether it's a US Make America Healthy Again agenda or a European, we're going to dictate to the world's farmers how you've got to farm if you want to do trade with us, they are the bigger problems to disrupting trade. And that's where we do need our own government and like-minded governments to hold firm and dictate some basic parameters to what trade deals should be done on.
We've already seen a bit of that, obviously, in Trump's Liberation Day speech when he singled out Australian beef and our biosecurity measures. Now, do you think that there is any threat that they could revisit that?
Well, I think we'll be fine once President Trump realises that McDonald's can't make burgers in the US without Australian beef. That should be the cut-through moment that might hold. But at the moment, on every front in domestic policy in the US, people are guessing. And it's not just all of us on the outside. Within the administration itself, it's a day-by-day proposition of what's going to come out of the White House. And so policy is all over the shop, but that also sees a lot of stagnation. And I think from a global trade perspective, the great problem we have with this disruption the US is providing is that they're not then in a leadership role in those global fora, which is actually really important. Whether you agree or disagree with whoever's in the administration at the time, the US has always been a very strong leader, and particularly one for good, balanced, fair trade to be occurring. And without them filling that role, we all start having challenges, whether it's with China, whether it's with other trading partners. So the problem is that it's chaos and nobody knows day to day what's happening. And that will lead to stagnation in a range of things not being progressed that we'll pay a price for over the coming decades.
I guess an example of that is America pulling out of the World Health Organization. So in that instance, right, they're not liable to the food standards that they implement? I mean, does that have an impact?
More in that they're still not providing that leadership into those global fora. And that's really where we do need strong partners, as opposed to just a trading partner with the US. Having partners like Canada and the US and Japan and others, bringing a sensible, functional, common sense perspective to international fora to contain some of the other trade behaviour that is driven by China predominantly and others, is the real cost for Australian farming. And that's the thing that we've got to keep our eye on most. The things that will actually really do farming in this country. And as I said, tariffs we can move about, they are disruptive, we'd prefer not to have them. But the fundamental rule changes that other countries are trying to use free trade agreements to impose on our own farming sector, where by every measure our farming sector outperforms theirs, they are the things that we need to hold firm on, and they are the things we need to coordinate across other trading partners with.
Well, that's really, when you mentioned the free trade agreements, I mean, that's very interesting. Obviously, they've been touted for a long time as being, you know, really good for Australian trade. But did we give away more things than we got?
Well, thankfully, both the current federal government and the previous government finally really rejected the European Free Trade Agreement on the basis that the Europeans, quite frankly, were overreaching, trying to dictate agronomic policy in this country, trying to tell farmers what products they could use and couldn't use. Even though, as I've mentioned, on every measure, our farmers are better than European farmers in productivity and in environmental sustainability. So that is why ensuring that the free trade agreements don't give away too much and certainly don't compromise our sovereignty when it comes to our own farming policies and practices. And in a discussion with Julie Collins the other week, I was glad to hear that the current government is staying consistent now that the Europeans have come back to the table, because the Europeans are back saying we really do want this free trade agreement. So they're starting the process again, which will be a great, make work program for a bunch of public servants in Canberra in the Department of Foreign Affairs. A few Paris trips are on the books, no doubt. But what is really good to hear is that Minister for Industry, Minister for Trade and Minister for Ag are already saying we will not have farming and agricultural practices dictated to us by a trading partner. We will agree to outcomes. We'll agree to being best practice in a range of areas. We will not be dictated to, and that's, I think, the most important thing.
So cycling back around to you, Jared, it seems obviously that the country bearing the brunt of the tariffs is actually the American people. If they're going to hurt the most from it, why do it?
Because Donald Trump has not paid a price for doing so. If you poll his supporters, and we saw polling on this, and I do polling at the USA Center on an annual basis, and if you ask the supporters, what do you think of these tariffs, or when we asked and others asked, what do you think of these tariffs that you are paying on China? And many times these farmers were essentially going bankrupt by China and others being very conscious of how to hurt Donald Trump politically. So they would deliberately target the reddest states, his political enemies, or I should say Trump's political allies. And every time the majority were saying, you know what, no, this is the right thing to do in the polls, right? They said, we agree with the president. It's time to fix the decades of wrongs by prior administrations, and we're going to take it on the chin, and it's not great, but this is the way things need to go. I think one thing that to really highlight, we were talking about this before, it's been mentioned, is that maybe people don't appreciate enough, is the death of libertarianism, and the death of that very weird period in the 90s when we really thought geopolitics could be removed from trade. It's very ahistorical to not have geopolitics in trade. That was really weird. You know what's even weirder? To not have war. We haven't had a war since the 1940s. That's insane if you look at historical trends, right? So I think we also have to maybe open our aperture a little bit to see what's weird and what sort of historical norms. In many ways, we talk about strategic competition and all this geopolitics, but in many ways, we're reverting to the mean.
I mean, are there any historical norms? I mean, Dennis, this might be one for you in terms of these kinds of tariffs. I mean, have we ever seen anything quite like this before, this regime? I take that as a no.
I think from the conflict perspective, there's always been conflicts, and when you look at a broader conflict, I mean, it's not just people with weapons who are winning. The ones who win typically have resources, and that whether that's metals or food. The interesting thing I have to add to this, I'm thinking about how to kind of attack the question. One of the interesting things I've been looking at is whenever there's more geopolitical uncertainty and there's more and more disruptions, so for example, let's take the last 5 years in terms of supply chain disruptions, we've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the Houthi rebel attacks in the Red Sea. The more of these disruptions there are, the more the governments of importing countries get concerned about food security. And the more concern they have about food security, the more they want to build up their own self-sufficiency. And it could be through tariffs, it could be through import bans, it could be through subsidies for their farmers. So take an importing country like, I don't know, like an Egypt, for example, or a China. They're all trying to increase, historically been very large importers, but they're all trying to increase how much food production they can have locally, so they're less reliant on the rest of the world. And the more geopolitical instability we have, the more governments are going to subsidize their farmers. Governments of countries who typically import a lot, the more they're going to subsidize their farmers, the more they're going to put restrictive trade barriers in place so that they can produce more locally. And an actual big risk is it happened. How much context do I give? Basically, in World War I, there was a significant amount of food shortages in Europe. And following World War I, there was a lot of countries, including France and Germany and the UK, who all said, you know what, we had so many food shortages in World War I that we never want to be in that situation again. So they heavily subsidized their food production. As a result, there was about a decade of lower prices. And mechanically, how does it work? Well, usually when you have low prices, what do farmers do? They start producing less, maybe use less fertilizer, maybe don't plant as much. But when you have governments continuing to subsidize food production, saying we don't want to be caught short on food, well, we know prices are low, we'll top you up in terms of your profitability, just keep farming. What it results in is in a glut globally of supply, and it could end up in a period of this like uneconomic period of lower prices for longer. That's a risk of having more tariffs, especially coming from countries who want to beef up their food production locally.
Now, I want to jump back on this issue of fair trade agreements. Rebecca, obviously, we've just discussed now the dangers of some of them to our local primary producers in potentially dictating how they can farm. Is this a concern for farmers and particularly grain growers?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I'll give you an example. I assume most people who've grown canola here are in the ISCC accreditation system. You know, they're basically telling us what their European considers to be sustainable agriculture. And one example is you can't spray within 500 metres of body of water. Where all their bodies of water are connected, ours are not. We have isolated dams. So that dictating of you have to meet this particular standard if you want to be able to export to our country is actually an example of a non-trade barrier. You know, going back to free trade agreements, they've been very effective in dealing with tariffs in the past, and they've opened up a lot of markets for us. But we're in a world now where non-tariff measures are actually more impactful than tariffs are. So there's just been some research recently done by ABARE, which basically said that the non-tariff measures equivalent tariff rate on Australian agriculture is 19%. So here we are talking about 10% from Trump, yet non-tariff measures are costing Australian agriculture an equivalent tariff of 19%, or, put another way, $40 billion a year. So we have to start thinking about how we actually start to address these free trade measures and understand that tariffs are one discussion, but the discussion we're actually missing a lot is actually non-tariff measures. And that means when we start to do our free trade agreements, they still have a place in our bilateral agreements, but we have to start thinking about them in terms of what can we do to address these non-tariff measures? What are the, you know, can we get them to recognise our certification and assessment standards? Can we actually harmonise the standards of, for example, our MRL levels that they actually are putting on us when we're exporting to these countries to be in line with Codex, which is the internationally recognised scientifically based? And we have to be able to start writing into our free trade agreements things like that we can use it, that we cannot have what I'm going to call them illegal under the WTO rules of non-tariff measures. They're discriminatory, they're not achieving a purpose, they've got various standards which we need to be able to then use the World Trade Organization or some other mechanism to resolve these disputes. And that's really important in how we approach these free trade agreements. And something like the announcement the other day where they're going to renegotiate the free trade agreement between China and Australia, we have to start rethinking it, because China has a lot of these non-tariff measures. For example, weed seeds into China for grain, 0%. Now, it's not realistic that we can, and a lot of countries have this that we export to, a 0% weed seeds, unless you're going to clean entire cargoes of grain. And these are weeds that are usually in the other country. So they're being used for political purposes by that other country as a way for them to control when we can export there and when we can't. So these are sort of things we need to start addressing in our free trade agreements. But non-trade, they're complex, they're ever evolving, they're very much centred around the domestic policies that that country has, but we need to start finding other ways to address non-trade measures. And free trade is one of them, but there are other things we need to think about as well.
I think this is a great spot to take some questions from the floor. Does anyone have any questions for any of our panellists? I'll jump over. Was it you, sir? Oh, that was you. Sorry, I was looking in the wrong spot there.
Is that me?
Yeah, you've got to hold it really close to your face.
Oh, look, thanks. This is fantastic. I've got just the panel there. I want to just quickly ask you, because as a layman, I observed over time, ScoMo brought in, and I'm not a defender of Scott Morrison, but he did bring in a review of the Foreign Investment Review Board, I believe. I understood that before the government prior to him, without getting political, had made it, there was a $200 million limit to make an investment in Australia before it triggered an inquiry or an application through the Foreign Investment Review Board. With a panel like this, I'm hoping somebody can answer this. And then a lot of China's policies or tariffs against us was more to do with that than anything else. And like the Republican farmers, I kind of think, well, yeah, stick it to them. Like, is it so wrong that a farmer could say, well, take it on the chin, I don't like what's happening? Is that true? Was it 200 million? And then did the government come back in, the Labor government came back in after the Morrison era and wipe that and allow foreign investment again, like unpoliced?
I don't. The Foreign Investment Review Board and the parameters it's working on haven't fundamentally changed. They changed the thresholds, and I think it's maybe something Australia can probably get better at is backing national interest, because we seem to have, and it's different. It's different in the US. It's different in Canada. It's different in Europe, where they do competitive processes on whether it's investment basis or contracts for government and the like. But then they still ensure that national interest isn't compromised, whether it's the Jones Act in the US that means that only US-based companies can build, well before Trump got in this message, that only US-based companies can build ships for the US Navy. Europe has a range of them as well. I don't think we've gone as well to that threshold point of making sure that national interest then is the prevailing decision at the end. The fundamental differences, though, and that's the whole purpose of the Foreign Investment Review Board, is to protect that national interest. So it hasn't fundamentally changed. I think for ag, the biggest issue, not getting into who should own what, and certainly not going to mention any ports in Darwin, the biggest issue for ag, from a foreign investment perspective, is that it is the sector that has the lowest foreign investment out of every other industry in the country. So irrespective of where it's coming from, that leads into major productivity issues for ag. And I think that's maybe something I'm more concerned about, while still a little more national interest at the end of critical infrastructure and the like being protected. But investing, having the ag sector here is seen as a great investment opportunity for other countries. We have great investment and it's across the board, but compared to every other industry, we have very, very low foreign investment in ag, and that does have a productivity impact.
Can I add to that? Sorry, I've actually, when I came to Australia from the US in 2017, as you can tell from my thick Australian accent, I was actually brought out to do a report on the US-Australian investment relationships. I looked at FIRB, I met with FIRB, and I generally try to allow the Australians to speak for Australian things. I talk about America. With FIRB, I will say there's one thing for what they say publicly, but having met with them, I think since 2020, they have gotten far more sensitive to China. So again, it's one thing for them to say publicly, we still accept investment, but I will say privately, they are far more skeptical of China than they would ever say publicly. And in many ways, that makes sense. I think that's logical, and that's what Japan has done in terms of engaging with China. Japan has increased its military spending significantly and stood up to China, and it financed that increase of military spending by trading with China, right? We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Anyone else?
Hello, I'm from the Mid-North Coast, a beef farmer. I'd just be really interested in your comments regarding separating national interest and security and trade. So we've just had Albanese in China. You've spoken about those countries that are importing food. What about those countries that are exporting like us? Thank you.
I can answer partially. Yes, sir. One of the challenges, whether it's looking at Australia now or 100 years ago, we have the exact same problem. While we've grown a lot, it's all been export-oriented. So if you look at certain states like WA, 80% of pretty much everything they grow has to go overseas. For us, a little bit less because we have a larger population on the East Coast. But if you want more of a buffer from what's happening overseas, whether it's European sustainability policies or it's Chinese economic coercion, the answer largely is to build more domestic demand. Because then you don't have to send as much overseas. One of the things that has been floated and now is getting more traction is to create a biofuels industry in Australia. Biofuels are crop-based fuels. What are the advantages? One, we can actually use our canola, for example, locally, sending it all overseas, including to Europe. And the other advantage, I'm not sure how many of you know, but last year, any guess on how much of our total fuel use was imported? No? 95% was imported. I think it should be terrifying regardless of what industry you're in. If we can't get like ships in for whatever reason, for whatever disruption there is, not saying like a broader conflict, but I'm just saying in general, if there's a disruption in a particular part of the world where we get oil from, it's terrifying that 95% comes from overseas. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure our like national security reserves are about 3 weeks, and they're in America, they're not here, and they're in a cave. If we create a biofuels industry, we can actually use our agricultural products, including tallow, canola oil. If you make it ethanol-based, you can use wheat, you can use whatever else. Probably won't be using wheat, but you can use sugar products as well. If we create a crop-based fuel industry here, we can actually have something to use for our fuel, and we meet a national security issue, being more self-sufficient for fuel.
I'll just add something to that. I think, and I think Simon wants to as well. I think you talk about the national interest, and this is part of the issue. We are an exporter, net exporter. Most countries around the world are net importers of food, so they're not self-sufficient. So what you see from a majority of countries probably around the world is their policies are very much geared towards protecting their farmers and protecting their food security. And particularly in the world we're living in today, that is probably heightened a lot. So it is, when we're dealing with these countries, we're coming at it from a very different perspective and having to deal with their domestic policies, which is why we've seen the rise of non-tariff measures. Because as tariffs have come down, and they've actually been halved over the past 20 years or so, global tariffs, but we've seen the increase in non-tariff measures, it's because they're seeking to protect their own domestic interest in terms of their own farmers. And that is going to drive all of our negotiations that we do with these countries when we're trying to negotiate free trade agreements, bilateral agreements, or just one-on-one trying to sort out the complexities of a non-tariff barrier where it's not clear on how we actually can get product into the country or getting a permit. For example, Indonesia. In our free trade agreement, we struck up a deal with them a few years ago where we could export 500,000 tonnes of feed grain. Not one, but they have not issued one permit over the last few years for that. And that's because it's caught up in their domestic, basically their administration. India in particular, very much focused, which is why you see such heavy tariffs on pulses. So they're going to protect their national interests. So we're coming at it from a very different perspective to those importing countries, which is most of the countries in the world.
Madeline, just really quickly, government, the federal government made a election commitment last year for $3.5 million for a food security strategy, which is sort of basically there's a bit of a link between those, and one big part of it is about biofuels and about the viability of a biofuel industry in Australia. So I guess it's that's one. We don't know, we haven't heard yet about what the process is government's going to do to start to consult and to start to build that. But if it's going to be very, very important, obviously, for our sector to get united around that one as well.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for the time you've given us tonight. Hopefully you'll let me have two goes at this. One is trade uncertainty. My understanding is most traders hate uncertainty, knowing whether or not by the time that gets off the boat, the price has changed. Is there a premium for a reliable trading partner that's going to be consistent? And the other one is with the unorthodox solution finding methods that the US government's using for their economic woes, is that going to spell the end of the US dollar as the international trading currency?
Yes and no. So yeah, the first question, uncertainty is terrible. And speaking of non-tariff barriers, we focus so much on the numbers. You know, right now Trump has elevated the tariff levels from like 2 to 3% to 20%. That's according to the Yale Budget Lab. And yeah, that's bad in itself, but the uncertainty, like you said, is the worst, because when someone sits on their hands waiting for just clarity and certainty, what is that? By definition, that's a recession. Wait long enough becomes a depression, right? So in many ways, you could argue that if he had simply set the Liberation Day tariffs and then not changed them a million times, we'd be in a better situation because we'd have more certainty. So you're completely right. How do you price that premium? It's hard to really give a definition to it, but we just have to realize that we can either, again, bang our head against the same wall and put all our political capital into saying, let's just like set this and forget it and be done, and then we'll work around it. Or we can say, all right, Trump's going to do his weird thing. Let's focus on eking out some stability elsewhere. Now, in terms of the US dollar, there's a lot of debate on that. I don't think we have enough time to cover all of it tonight. But I think on the whole, the US dollar, I've never seen the bond market move like it did in April after the Liberation Day tariffs. That was pretty terrifying. But I still think on the whole, there's not really an alternative just now. And to get an alternative, you really need a combination of events to take place that I don't think are likely anytime soon.
I think we've got one up there.
Thank you. Look, terrific panel tonight. It's so great to have a group like you address us tonight. Really appreciate it. I'm David Young. I'm chair of the Wool Committee. So certainly any tariffs on China are going to affect wool into the US and to the rest of the world. That's going to affect us. So I'll push my own barrow there. Second part is not casting any aspersions onto the age of the gathering here tonight, but pharmaceuticals and Trump's obsession with trying to put tariffs and cost onto pharmaceuticals out of Australia. Would you care to comment on that? I'm sure the audience will appreciate your response. Thank you.
Sorry, just the obnoxious American talking all night long. Pharmaceuticals. I think I tried to mention this before, but this was a structural, what you're seeing now is the Trump administration putting laser focus on what countries in Europe and Australia and New Zealand are spending on pharmaceuticals, saying, you guys are paying so little, we are actually subsidizing the R&D of these pharmaceutical companies so that you can get the latest medicines. And it's not fair. A Harris administration would have done the same thing. Would they have been so rude about it? Probably not. But they would have done the same thing. This should not be surprising. It's politically untenable for to maintain the status quo. Let's not forget what Joe Biden did when he was in office. He set the price of insulin to $35. It was exponentially higher than that. And even that is exponentially higher than what Australians pay, right? So the US is playing catch up on pharmaceuticals, and I keep telling the industry here and the government, there's no way around this. Doesn't matter who wins the next election, that is political suicide for a US president to not try to deal with that somehow.
Rebecca, you touched on the fact that we have no subsidies in Australia for farmers, and yeah, I sometimes have grant and subsidy jealousy of some of these countries. But what are we doing to think about our global future? Farming, we're all getting older. I notice most of us in the room here are ageing as well. What are we doing to promote farming and give younger people a potential boost and I guess give them a sense of there is a future in farming and encourage them to take up the mantle for the rest of us who are, getting to the end of our farming careers?
I'll try and answer a little bit in the context of this panel on that one. One thing that I've taken interest in lately is our claim that we are 70% export orientated and we have food security. I actually would say, are we really food secure? And yes, the strategy, I learned about that today. But we have to ask, when we say we're food secure, yeah, we've got an exportable surplus on grain, on beef, on sugar, but can we live on those things? What about things like milk? What about things like eggs? What about things like fruit and veg? Would we, if you went to the average consumer and say, if you're happy to cut half of the fruit and veg that you've got on your shelf, are we food secure? I think most of them would be horrified. So I'm not sure we're as food secure as we claim to be, and I'll leave the imports, the input side of it, which we are not secure on by any stretch of the imagination. But I think when we sit here and say we are food secure, and that's a rhetoric we've been running, that influences all the policy that our government has. So when the government thinks we're food secure, what do they think? Oh, well, who cares if we lose a few farmers along the way, because we're food secure and we're always going to be food secure. I don't believe we are food secure. I bring into question when we sit there and say 70% exports, we're food secure. By sector, that is actually not the case. And then we've got the fact that we are very reliant on our fuel, our chemicals, fertiliser, all these things are imported. And that goes to so in the context of this thing, that goes to the government's policies of how they drive our superannuation, how they give our grants and subsidies. Everything the government does when it comes to agriculture, they go, we're food secure, it doesn't matter if we lose some farmers. So I think we have to start thinking about the rhetoric we're actually speaking out. And I think the project, which Simon might talk to a little bit, is actually really important in sending the message that I don't think we're as food secure as we make out to be, which is driving all our policies.
It's definitely not my project, although I wouldn't mind. AgriFutures Australia will definitely have a role to play, and all of you can as well. I think the broader concept you're talking about, though, how else do you get younger people into farming? You know, there's a whole range of policy levers that the federal government and the state and territory governments can pull. Some of it involves how we provide taxation. Some of it involves how we deal with land use. There's I know this conference has dealt with land use conflict a lot over many years. How you allocate land. There's a whole series of policy levers about how do you encourage young people in, and it's very, very difficult given the price of land, the price of cost of entry into farming is very, very high. So but that's something that the RDCs, the Rural Development Corporations, all collectively should own and continue to invest in research to inform government policy decision making in around that, because it's absolutely critical for a whole range of reasons, not only food security but national security as well.
Thank you. Given the geopolitical situation that's going on at the moment, I mean, we're seeing and will see a continuing record spend on defence. So now you mentioned earlier on the potential that countries as a result of this are going to spend more on subsidising food production, which has clearly been cut over the last 10, 20 years. Which one's more important, food or defence? And if a lot of money is spent on both, what suffers?
Okay, food or defence. I think you can't have a solid defence foundation unless you actually have a solid food foundation as well. One from the perspective of feeding ourselves and then feeding allies. So I think that defence is a very broad umbrella, and without having its parts secure that make up defense, it's not going to go well. So I'd say it's just as important. If you like, armies don't march on their stomachs, that's a pretty broad term that's been used through history. I know that's the extreme, but if you don't have a strong policy setting that would allow maybe local fertilizer manufacturing, local agrochemical manufacturing to some extent, then we'll be able to produce the food that we need, and then we'll be able to support the defense that we need. So it all comes hand in hand. I was going to say one last thing. Some agrochemicals, we import over 90% of them, close to 90% of them actually. And, some of them come from the exact same countries that we're now rivaling geopolitically. So, yep, bang on.
Perhaps as a former Defence National Security Advisor who's now in Ag, I might have to say it's both on a number of fronts. First of all, being an exporting nation of agricultural produce puts us in a very good position. It's a core foundation, being a food exporter, to your own national security. Good regional relations and the like. Food security is at the foundation of national security. And I think, I think it was when I first came over from defence industry, because I spent a little time in that sector, I made the call that I was fascinated that in defence policy terms, a government puts a lot of effort into developing white papers every 10 years, looking at a 50-year horizon, doing serious strategic planning, but we don't do it in agriculture. And it is just as important. And we see it on issues of how food secure are we? Well, we've got the world's best farmers, but cut them off from every input that you need to farm, and it disappears very, very quickly. So we have about 1 degree of depth in our food security, and that rests with the talent of our own farming sector, farmers themselves. Where policy needs to focus is security of supply. The global disruption to trade during COVID gave government a bit of a fright moment, where all of a sudden they saw us not being able to provide everything the farmers need, but we got through it. They still haven't got their head around it, which is why the food security initiative being undertaken, the support work around it, of building agriculture, farming policy into the foundation of our own national security policy is a very good thing. We just need government to actually deliver on it because producing food is as important as an effective defence force.
I know I already spoke, but I might add just one last thing. I know I'm going to the extreme, but sometimes I like looking at the extremes because it helps us understand the present a lot more. The challenge Australia had from a grains industry perspective is that as soon as the war started, there was no freight availability. It was either sunk by the enemy or ships that weren't domiciled here, which is the vast majority of ships. We barely own any freight vessels. Like on 2 hands, you can count. So either they were sunk, they were taken back overseas, the countries where they were domiciled, or they were simply too afraid to come to Australia in case government would actually confiscate them. So suddenly we had grain piling up across the country. So the other food security challenge, or the food security of our allies for challenge, is us not only being able to produce the food, but actually being able to physically get it to them in a crisis.
And it goes to all the points, nearly every question that's touched on, whether it's about driving young people into ag, because there is no better sector to be in. You're guaranteed a job, and that job isn't just about out in the paddock. A job in ag is as much in a lab or in R&D or as on farm. So there is no better sector if you want a job for life, and we need to challenge that. The disaster of losing all the ag science schools was unforgivable. And so government needs to be driving back into that. There are a whole range of issues that we can encourage people into ag, but let's be clear, the national interest issue, we're talking about foreign investment before, essentially it's 30 years of failed industry policy in Australia and 30 years of very focused industry policy out of Beijing that sees us positioned where we are on reliance on their inputs, and the one advantage we have is that they need us to grow. I think there's some real go-to points for government to start executing in this space.
Thank you. Dennis, I think you might have quoted earlier, I may have got this wrong, but there was inherent competitive advantage. And so we as farmers, as individuals, and those that go out and do our thing day by day, no subsidies being mentioned, everything else, we do a pretty good job and we're pretty economically efficient at what we do. You touched on just a minute ago, basically nearly answering this question, But as far as freight goes, as far as our processing space in abattoirs and things, and also probably the monopoly on the point of processing of all our stock, and then we go to rail freight, and if it's costing somewhere between $45 to $50 a tonne to get grain from central New South Wales into port, that is probably where we have a disadvantage, in my opinion, on some other countries. And I'd just like to probably, whilst everything's been put on how well we do at the bottom end and how everybody wants our product and we are exporters here, what can we do in the middle to try and free up a little bit of space, make a little bit more fat for the farmer?
Yeah. How do I put this? How well an industry can thrive in terms of how much they can produce and how much they can grow hinges upon the logistical system of that country. So if you have a very expensive logistical system because it's very poor and there's a lot of loss in it, because it's inefficient, the farmer gets less, and then they have less incentive to be more productive and expand. I was speaking to a bloke from Nigeria. It wasn't a scam call, I swear. Still looking for those funds, no. I was speaking to this, it was a grain trader in Nigeria, and he said one of the challenges there is that between the point where the farmer harvests and when it actually gets into a flour mill, something like 40 or 45% is lost. That it's either due to rodents, it's due to literally falling off the back of a truck, whether that's corruption or genuine, whether due to rain. And as a result, the big problem is that farmers barely get they don't get good prices for their grain because a lot of it is lost along the way. The supply chain is very inefficient, and they have no incentive to expand their production. Now, I asked, is there a way to circumvent this? Is there a way to fix this? Can you get more investment into the country? Then you improve your logistical capacity. Investment is tough because there's a lot of corruption, and then foreign money doesn't actually want to come in because they're worried about, I might not actually get my money out eventually. From an Australian perspective, we either have to have local players who continue to invest in the ag supply chain to make the supply chain more efficient, and as a result, it costs less to move grain from your location to the port, and you can get a better price. Either our domestic players have to do that, or foreign players have to come in and invest. And if there hasn't been enough of it, possibly it comes down to the issue you were talking about, where the level of investment in the Australian ag is actually quite low, and not necessarily talking about ag lands, but it could be supply chain infrastructure, which then has its own problems because then you start talking about national security. So it's a bit of a challenge, but the main point, if you want to pin it down as to how to get better prices for our farmers compared to what the global level is once it leaves on a ship, it's improving that supply chain from the farmer to the port. Question is, how do you do it? Well, do you want to open up for more foreign investment? Well, there's been concerns raised about that, so that's what we have to tackle. But make the supply chain more efficient, farmers get a better price.
I'll answer it from a grain perspective, but I'll just make the comment. We are basically of duopolies and monopolies. I mean, banks. Our top 4 banks and the top 10 most profitable banks in the world. And we've, I think it was said today, 26 million people. Look at our supermarkets controlling 70% between 2. You go to the grain supply chain. As a farmer, you're seeing lots of people buying your grain out there. You've got, 10 or so, I'm in Moree, we're very fortunate. We've got the domestic market. We've got lots of people buying it. But what we don't have, and why we're actually, I think, getting, one of the nice terms, stuffed on prices, is there's no competition along the supply chain. So we are, at the end of the day, price takers on the world market. And the price that we get is export parity. And we have lots of buyers sitting there around, say, Moree, buying it, but there's only 1 or 2 people controlling, or companies controlling, those supply chains from the farmer right through to the export. So you are seeing the trade. If you control that supply chain, there's no competition. You can take whatever margins you want. And I know traders at times are taking anywhere up to $50 a tonne to line their pockets. We have a real problem in this country in the grain in terms of controlling the supply chain. Lots of buyers. It looks like there's lots of competition, but there is not, because the supply chain from my farm to the thing is controlled by one or two companies. How we reverse that at this point in time, I don't know how you do it. But these are companies who are in it for the money. They're not in it for us, and they want to control the supply chain. You've only got to look at how much of the grain out of each state is controlled by 1 or 2 companies. They are the same companies that own the export terminals and own the trains and the supply chain. So it is a real problem, and it's across the board in agriculture. It's not just grains.
Now, I know you've all got a ton more questions, but we're out of time, so I'm going to hand over to Chris to wrap things up.
On behalf of Business and Economic and Trade Committee of New South Wales Farmers, I'd like to thank the panellists for bringing their input on this discussion of Trump, trade and tariffs, and as well as Madeline for being the moderator for the Daily Telegraph for the air. It's been a very insightful night and very knowledgeable. Thank you very much.